My name is Forrest Elliott Harris Sr. I am president of this beloved college, American Baptist College. And we are pleased to host this very important discussion on the death penalty. You are here at a great time as it relates to the history of American Baptist College. This is our 95th year of existence and my 20th year of leadership of this great school. Wow. We call it, because of that history and because of its civil rights history, we call it affectionately the Holy Hill. And because of this significant discussion we're going to have, what a place to have it. In a space where justice has been at the center of the identity of an educational institution, and civil rights icons like Georgia Congressman John Lewis, the Reverend C.T. Vivian, James Bevel, and Dr. Julius R. Scruggs are graduates of this school. And from that list, the Reverend C.T. Vivian and Congressman John Lewis are recipients of the highest civilian honor, the President Medal of Freedom. So we're glad you're in this space. This is where people have stood. This part of the chapel has been serving as our religious place for worship and engagement with the gospel of justice and liberation. And as you can see the mural behind you, you can see a crucified one. And how many persons in our country, bodies have been crucified because they did not align with the imperial powers of their time. And so this discussion we're having today with this panel, I welcome you here on this platform, because according to reports, there are 54 citizens in the Tennessee corrections system on death row. Wow. And those realities, that reality, is not to determine if they are guilt or innocent, but the discussion of the death penalty overall, whether it is humane, whether it is something human beings should do. This is basically, I think, a discussion about the intersection of faith and justice, humanity, and how we can lead humanity forward beyond the kinds of ways in which we choose to end persons' lives and continue to hold on to what the integrity of our humanity collectively means. Amen. It's time to be open, heartfelt, honest, and conscious about our humanity and how humane we can live in this country. Recognizing the systems, the structures that have caused many people to be incarcerated and many innocent people who are on death row, the opportunity for their humanities to be transformed and express the full freedom that they were intended for in God's creation. So I'm happy to be here to welcome you for this panel discussion. I wish I could stay for the entire discussion, but I know by virtue of the names here on the panel, and because you're on the Holy Hill, the dialogue is going to be very, very rich for us to be advocating for the freedom of Abu-Ali Abdur'Rahman. And I hope that it will help spark and push us forward as we consider what freedom means for him and all persons like him who are on death row. Thank you so much and welcome to American Baptist College.
My name is Rudy Kalis, and this is a whole different world for me. I spent 43 years as a sportscaster at Channel 4, and somehow God said, now I want you to do more important work. And so I became, when I retired 2 years ago, a full-time volunteer for Men of Valor, the prison ministry. I'm at Riverbend Maximum Security 4 days a week. Bible studies 4 days a week, including on Sunday night on death row. And so for the last year and a half or so, I've gotten to know Abu-Ali very, very well. And so when I was asked to officiate this, I'm not an activist. I'm a facilitator, I guess. I just want this conversation to be had because I've looked into the eyes of this man and I want to see that he gets the right things done for him. So what this is that in his case, from what I said at Riverbend, that's been his home. The speakers that you hear and going to hear are much more important than I. They have insight, they have faith, and they have information. They are experts at their fields, and so we will conduct a conversation on that. Together we're here to announce the launch of a public campaign to support clemency for Abu. It is important to note that the clemency here does not mean release. It means that the campaign supports the recent decision by the Davidson County Criminal Court after discussion with the DA and with the victims to reduce the death penalty sentence to life in prison. Covering the long span of this case, there are now 4 judges from 4 different courts who agree with that recommendation. And so we talk about that. Justice for Abu is a diverse grassroots coalition of people who have come together to add their voice to support Abu. Again, I'm not a public face of this campaign. I am a friend who has looked in the eyes of a redeemed man and want his case to be heard and for justice to prevail in all of this to come through. So we have some excellent speakers, and then we will have a panel discussion. And the first speaker I'd like to invite to the podium is from one of the nation's leading voices on the death penalty litigation question. Please welcome from Charlotte, North Carolina, Mr. Henderson Hill.
Good afternoon. Well, it's wonderful to be here. I bring you greetings from Mecklenburg County, North Carolina. That's Charlotte. And it would be rude and impolite to come to Davidson County, to Nashville, and speak ill of its citizens. And it's not my intent to do that. But having heard Dr. Harris, and understanding that, we are on the Holy Hill, that this is sanctified ground, it's hard not to speak truth to power or to speak truth to wrong. And so that's what we're here to do. I do not know Abu-Ali as Rudy does. I had a chance to meet Rudy and enjoyed meeting you this morning. And I'm touched by the fact that you are touched by Abu's humanity, his decency, and the fact that he has gifts to give, and that you're in touch with that. Rudy, what I would say to you is welcome to my world. And it's a hard one, because what unites Davidson County, Nashville, and Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, and Montgomery County, Mississippi, is we are tied in a very real way to a legacy that's has a hideous history. And there are 3,100 odd, I may get that count wrong, 3,400 odd counties in our union. And it's remarkable to think that out of those counties, there are really only 15 or 16 that regularly use the death penalty. And for so long, Davidson County was not measured as one of those counties. And it's heartbreaking to hear this slide back into this relic of a criminal justice policy. One might ask, why are we here? Why is Davidson County here? Given the progress and the strides it had been making for years, even decades. it's interesting, the United States Supreme Court was sort of forced with that challenge just recently. That's what unites us to Montgomery County, Mississippi, Winona, Mississippi, because at the end of the term last year, the very last week of the term, the Supreme Court's term, the court examined the case of Curtis Flowers. I have the privilege of now representing Mr. Flowers as he is pending for the 7th trial. The 7th trial. This promises to be a real crucible. This man, unlike Abu-Ali, has professed innocence, and every indication is, every piece of evidence suggests he is innocent. And he has survived 6 capital trials and is now pending a 7th. What unites us here is the level of prosecutorial misconduct, the broken nature of the criminal justice system, and we're going to spend some time talking about how this system is broken. How when we ask jurors to leave their daily lives and to come to the courthouse and to sit in judgment of their fellow citizens, this is a special trust we are making with our citizens, that they would sit in our court of justice and adjudicate guilt and innocence and life and death. What is our promise to these jurors, to these citizens? It's that they should have confidence in the way our justice system works. They should have confidence that the person for whom the accusing finger has been pointed is acquitted with counsel who is competent, counsel who is caring, and counsel who is loyal and energetic. It should have confidence that the state is represented by counsel who is moral, counsel that is committed to principles of justice, counsel who seeks justice. Should have confidence that there will be an arbiter that's fair, that weighs the contesting positions of each party and applies the law fairly. Well, what we're here today to discuss is how all of that broke down. I've not met Abu, but I've read the record. And that record fits in the broad spectrum of cases I have read. And it fits also with what the Supreme Court dealt with in Flowers. No one other than Justice Kavanaugh was so disturbed by the record that he had seen of these 6 prior trials. What he saw was a relentless determination by the state to exclude African Americans from sitting in judgment. Can you believe all 35 African Americans who appeared on these prior trials were excused? In fact, I may have misspoken just as I thought about it. In that last trial, the state ran out of peremptory challenges. Oops! And so one African American juror sat. But the will was there to exclude, and if he had just that one more peremptory, there's no doubt what the result would be. And this discrimination against African American citizens is not new. I mean, this hails back when Kavanaugh was discussing Flowers. He related the challenge in Flowers to the wake of the Civil War. 1868, the passage of the 14th Amendment, guaranteeing the civil liberties of the enslaved, formerly enslaved. In 1875, the passage of the Civil Rights Act criminalized discrimination against African Americans from jury service. This is part of our history, and the violation of it is also part of our history. What happened in Davidson County is not just the result of Mr. Zimmerman's machinations. He didn't come of this by himself. There's a legacy in our courthouses that brings these practices to our doorsteps. In 1971, in 1986 and in 1987 too. For Mr. Flowers, it was 1996. In North Carolina, and we are sister states, Tennessee and North Carolina. And there's a lot that binds us together. When I was reading the record, I learned that in Tennessee, only one appellate case reversed a decision based on a violation of Batson. That's the case that prohibits race discrimination in jury selection. Only one out of the more than 100 cases that have raised the issue. Well, this is how you know that Tennessee and North Carolina are so closely linked. Not only do we share a border, we share horrible history. We can do you one better. In all our history, since 1986, since Batson, we have not reversed one, count, not one conviction or sentence based on a Batson violation. That's a horrendous history to share. And what brings us together, North Carolina and Tennessee, is that this legacy runs deep. And when I read the record of what Mr. Zimmerman did, and realized it's not accidental, he taught this as part of how he trained other lawyers, much like the lawyers in North Carolina who went to training programs. In our case, it was the Top Gun program. And they were explicitly taught how to deal with black citizens when they reported for jury service and how to exclude them from service. Can this be right? Can it be moral? So this is one end. This is one part of the spectrum for why we're here. But this legacy, it's often called the original sin of our country. This legacy is not limited to the issue of jury service. It's a criminal justice system that brings in the intent to oppress and to marginalize a part of our society. And that part is historically the African American community. It's now been expanded to other communities that can be otherized. And we really must be alert to this danger. I think back at the many jurors I have selected. And in capital cases, we individually visit with jurors. We spend time with them. We impress upon these jurors both what we're entrusting to them and what we expect of them. To think that the representative of the state would, in bold fashion, mischaracterize the evidence. We are telling these jurors that we don't ask you to impose a death penalty willy-nilly. It's reserved for the worst of the worst crimes and the worst offenders. It is universally understood that there are some aspects of an individual that make them less culpable. So if you're a child, if you're a youth, if you're under 18, that very youth is one of the aspects that make you less culpable. If you are mentally ill, if you suffer from serious mental ill, universally is thought that you are not as culpable as someone in full possession of their faculties. If you are intellectually disabled, formerly referred to as retarded, it is thought that cognitive deficit makes you less culpable. The thought that the district attorney would hide the evidence that Abu-Ali had serious mental illness, and that this serious mental illness was apparent through school, through childhood, was apparent in his brief military service. He was determined to be unfit for military service. When you understood the social history that he went through, physical abuse, sexual abuse, an early imprisonation at 18, and ritual, repeated sexual violation in a prison facility.
When you hear the diagnoses, post-traumatic stress disorder, and you see in the history how that diagnosis was inflamed and contributed to his misconduct, could that in any moral way be kept from the jury? Not hardly. What makes it much more difficult as lawyers, as part of the system, is to read the transcripts and to see that this conduct was deliberate. I feel that as a lawyer from the outside. How then must Mr. Funk feel when he is the elected representative of Davidson County and he recognizes that it is his office that was responsible for this prosecution? His office that deliberately and intentionally disguised from the jury all of the evidence of mental health impairment, all of the evidence that this was, yes, a broken man in many ways, an impaired man in many ways. But when I think of the worst of the worst, and I think about the number of lives that have been lost in tragic drug-related crimes and turf battles, senseless gang activity, and I think, well, in this case, this broken man in some misguided, perhaps even delusional thought, was going to do his bit to reduce drug trafficking, and out of this delusional, not well thought out plan, a life was tragically lost. It's wrong, it's unlawful, and yes, punishment should be appropriate. Accountability is an important value. But is this the worst of the worst? When even in the nature of the criminal act, there's the evidence of that striving to do good, striving to contribute, however misguided. Is this the worst of the worst? So there's much to be shared at this panel. I'm looking forward to that conversation. But what I'm here to tell you is that what's happening in Davidson County is not isolated. That what's happening in Davidson County links us with communities across the country. That we have to work against these forces that pull us back into this legacy that we should be free of. And there's hope. Mr. Funk represents that hope. You know, we've got rulings by 4 judges that represent that hope. At every level of state and federal courts, there are members of the judiciary that have recognized this and have said, this can't be right. This does not hold faith to the commitment we make to our communities and to our jurors. So I'm privileged to be with you in Nashville. Your jurors are just like our jurors. Some of them are faith-going, some of them are not. Some of them are Christians, some of them are not. Some worship a different God. But when they come into that courtroom and they receive the instructions of the judge, and I've been in that situation. I've sat as a juror. I've adjudicated another citizen. There is something special that envelopes that citizen. And we're here to say that we've got to protect that something special. We can't let those citizens, like the jurors who passed judgment on Abu-Ali, be called into court, take on this most sober responsibility, and be hoodwinked. Hoodwinked by our representatives. So this is what this campaign is all about. It's lifting up to people like Rudy, who was a part of the community, but until very recently, not really well informed about how our laws are implemented this campaign is to do, is to raise the consciousness of other people of goodwill. Because when people of goodwill see what is done in our name, they will repeatedly say no. You know, people of goodwill are and should be and will be that conscience that controls the exercise of public power. And this campaign, it's the start of it here in Davidson County. Thank you for welcoming me. Thank you for inviting me. Look forward to working with you.
Thank you, Henderson. Our next speaker is a longtime friend of Abu's. He's an attorney, a longtime friend, as I say, goes out to Riverbend once a week or as often as he possibly can, calls Abu a brother. And so it's with pleasure we invite Ed Miller to step forward.
I am an Episcopalian, and I'm a parishioner at Christ Church Cathedral. In 2011, my life was transformed when I became involved in the Cathedral's death row prison ministry program and met Abu-Ali Abdur'Rahman. Abu was physically and emotionally abused as a child. As a result, he suffers from PTSD. I have participated in several programs that provide support for children of need. As a result, I understand Abu's needs, which result from his childhood abuse. What is remarkable about Abu is that his childhood abuse led him to seek ways to help children of need. We come from very different backgrounds. He comes from an abusive childhood, and I come from a very loving family. We both have developed a desire to help children of need. This mutual desire brings us together. He is my brother. Abu is a deeply spiritual man who has overcome extreme difficulties to find meaning and purpose in his life. In 1988, he became a Muslim and devoutly followed the disciplines of Islam. In 2014, Abu asked me if he would be accepted in the Episcopal Church. I answered yes. Abu told me that the reason he asked the question was that during my previous visit with him, I had called him brother. He said that caused him to think about the number of Episcopalians who have helped him over the years. A couple of weeks later, Abu told me that he wanted to become an Episcopalian and that he wanted to do so on October 15, 2014, his 64th birthday. As requested, Bishop John Bowersmith went to death row and confirmed Abu as a communicant of the Episcopal Church. Today, he is a parishioner of Christ Church Cathedral. At the conclusion of Abu's confirmation service, Abu sang Amazing Grace. There was not a dry eye among the people present. This is a man whose parents never celebrated his birthday and never had a birthday cake for him. October 15, 2014, his 64th birthday was probably his happiest birthday. One day later, on October 16, 2014, Norma Fleischer, who visited Abu on a regular basis when she lived in Nashville, died in Lincoln, Nebraska. She moved to Nebraska from Nashville, and after that, she regularly corresponded with Abu. Because of her respect for Abu, she left him a small inheritance, a portion of which he contributed to Christ Church Cathedral. That was an act of love and kindness. My mother died in 2015. When I arrived at the funeral home for her visitation, I was directed to a flower arrangement. The card was from Abu-Ali and Linda. My mother did not live in Tennessee. To think that there was a condolence flower arrangement from a Tennessee death row inmate was overwhelming. I cried. I cry now. I know that the initiative to send the flowers was from Abu, and that Linda Manning responded respectfully to Abu's request. Abu is a man of compassion, which is demonstrated by his many acts of love and kindness. I am familiar with Abu's case. He was at the crime scene because of his desire to protect young black people from unlawful drug dealers, which was a noble cause. The mission was horribly and tragically misdirected. His defense attorney conducted no investigation and introduced no evidence in the guilt phase of the trial. I am confident that if the jury had been told the reason for Abu being present at the crime scene and had been told about his childhood abuse, his mental health, and about the blood evidence which shows that Abu could not have been the killer, the jury may have found him not guilty of premeditated first-degree murder, because he was not the killer. At sentencing, his lawyer presented no mitigating evidence about Abu's life history and mental illness. I am certain that if the jury had heard all of the evidence, which was never discovered by his lawyer, Abu would not have been sentenced to death. Abu has worked hard to overcome his profound difficulties in order to find meaning and purpose in his life. He has consistently striven to bring about peace and reconciliation within his prison community. Abu has completed a course in conflict resolution and reconciliation. The course has transformed the lives of participating inmates, and it has helped to make death row the most peaceful unit in the prison. Abu is a peacemaker, and he has helped improve life in the prison community. This has become his mission in life. It would serve no purpose for the government to take Abu's life. Taking his life would be a profound loss to the Tennessee Department of Correction and to all of us. All people, regardless of nationality, race, or religion, have an obligation to seek justice. Abu-Ali Abdur'Rahman does not deserve the death penalty. His life is worth saving, and justice calls for his life to be saved. He is my brother.
Used to write Abu, such a fascinating guy. Just on Sunday, first few months that I was in there, we just kind of stared. He wouldn't say much of anything in Bible study. So I'm just studying you, boy. And I'm a little bit older than he is. But then with time, when he sees that you're for real, he can really judge people. He's such a deep thinker, like you say. And it's a fellow inmate of his that led him to Christ, and then your efforts as well. Remarkable. Death row, bringing another man to life. So that's Abu, which is just remarkable. So thank you, Ed. Our next speaker is a clinical psychologist who also has known Abu for a long time, serves as his spiritual advisor. She is the interim director at the Osher Center for Integrative Medicine at Vanderbilt. So please welcome Dr. Linda Manning.
Good afternoon. I am so happy to be here on the Holy Hill and appreciate very much the warm welcome that all of us have received. I want to do one small correction. I was the interim director of the Osher Center at Vanderbilt until the end of April, at which time I retired. For the past 19 years, for several hours every week, I have visited with Abu-Ali Abdur'Rahman. We have visited on death row, and when his lawyers asked me first to get involved with him back in October of 2000, they wanted someone who had some knowledge of trauma and who could help Abu deal with his traumatic history and with the trauma of an upcoming execution that they anticipated would happen in the next 6 months. And here we are, 19 years later. I'm a licensed psychologist. I still teach a graduate course on trauma at Vanderbilt. And over the years, I've become very familiar with Abu-Ali's many traumas throughout his life. Ed mentioned them earlier in his talk. I'm familiar with how these have affected him and how he has suffered from them. And his difficulty still with staying present at times, because dissociation was what he learned as a child to escape from the conditions that he could not leave at 9 years old and 8 years old and 10 years old and so on. I am not only Abu's visitor, however, I am also designated as his spiritual advisor through Riverbend Maximum Security Institution. This came about because, as I said, we were anticipating an execution in the near future at the time. And Abu, who was born in the Christian church, but to a family that did not practice their Christianity, had been involved with a group that called themselves Christian, some organization called the Southeastern Gospel Ministry, that got him involved in this crime to begin with. And when the crime was over and Abu was arrested and moved to death row, they all completely abandoned him. So for a while, he was not fond of Christians or Christianity for obvious reasons. And as Ed said, he turned to Islam, and from his dedication to praying 5 times a day, to learning about the ethics and morals of Islam, to learning about its efforts toward peace, this helped him to discipline his life so that he could function in prison under the circumstances in which he lived. Because I was his spiritual advisor, I was able to be with Abu on death watch in 2002, where he was sequestered for 72 hours before the scheduled execution. And that execution was only stayed by the United States Supreme Court 36 hours beforehand. I've also been with him through the years when many other dates have been set and stayed by other courts along the way. So I feel like I know him very well in this amount of time. Abu-Ali lives a life of dignity and service in the worst of circumstances. I admire and respect more than I can tell you what he has done over the past 19 years to understand and heal from his own trauma. And I have watched as he has turned the horrors of his past into a passionate survivor mission focused on creating peace and harmony within the prison walls and beyond. His contributions are many and meaningful, and his life is worth saving. Abu-Ali has taken advantage of every opportunity afforded him on death row to accomplish his own healing and to work for the prevention of violence and healing of others. He works to create what he calls a therapeutic environment that is safe for everyone. He's been very involved in classes that have been offered by Vanderbilt faculty on philosophy and on the healing of trauma. And he learns through these classes, but he also teaches by sharing his own experience. During our visit this past Sunday, another inmate was talking to me about how long he had resisted looking at his own trauma and examining how that trauma had affected his life. But Abu's example and persistence over the years had changed his mind, and now he was involved in this class on healing trauma. Abu has also participated in creative writing and art classes offered by professors from the Watkins School of Arts, and has used both to offer creative expression on healing and compassion within the prison and beyond. His work has been exhibited in Nashville, New York, and Germany, and it graces the walls of my tiny apartment. His writing has been published in newsletters, journals, articles, pamphlets that he's created on domestic violence, and 2 collections of short stories together with other inmates in the prison. Abu-Ali is currently the clerk on death row. He has done a lot to reorganize the processes used on the unit in a way that benefits both the inmates and the officers and staff there. The staff depend on him. I have witnessed many times when officers have interrupted our visits in order to ask Abu for help with a problem with a particular inmate or a need that an inmate has, or for information on policies and procedures that no one else seems to be able to find. Abu has completed the certificate program, as Ed mentioned, in conflict resolution and mediation from Lipscomb University, and I know Janet will be telling you more about that in a few minutes. He's helped to create the program that's used on the unit to resolve conflict, and both between inmates, even those considered incompatible, and between officers and inmates. And he hopes to spread this program, this groundbreaking program, to other units at Riverbend and to other prisons across the state. As Ed mentioned, Abu-Ali is a deeply spiritual person. In his journey, he has studied Native American spirituality. He loves nature, and nature has always been his refuge as a child. He has integrated this with his study of Islam and now his study of Christianity. When Abu and I talked about his desire to come into the Episcopal Church, I said to him that I felt like this was his coming full circle back to the tradition of his birth that had been taken away from him by the injustices in his life. He integrates the wisdom of all these traditions, and this guides his commitment to nonviolence and his promotion of peace, harmony, healing, and love. If he has the chance, he will dedicate the rest of his life to this mission. Abu-Ali has become part of my family in the last 19 years. He sent birthday cards to my children over all those years. My 2-year-old grandson plays with him in the visiting room at Riverbend. He has taught me more about the power of faith and the power of the hope that comes from that faith than anyone else in my life. He and his fellow inmates, Akil and Kevin, recently offered a healing prayer for me to pass on to my sister, who is very ill. And Abu sang Amazing Grace to her on the phone when I was there visiting her in Richmond. His death would serve no purpose. As Ed mentioned, or someone mentioned, even the victims have agreed that life in prison is a reasonable response at this time. His death would eliminate a force for good in the world. He lives a life of dignity and service on death row, and his life is worth saving. I invite you all to get involved in this cause. Thank you.
Saturday mornings, we do a class on the low side, and then we always go over to the high side, and Dr. Mack is always, or most of the time, sitting there with him. You bring him too many snacks, because these guys don't get much of that, and they do that. But he's called us a blessing. He's got good tears in his eyes the Sunday that we talked about what had just happened, what's evolved, what's going on here, because he said, I never would have thought, it's just by the grace of God, that this discussion is even being held. Our next speaker is a trained community organizer, one of Nashville's most influential leaders, and the first woman to serve as a senior pastor at New Covenant Christian Church in its 160-year history. She's a graduate of Leadership Nashville class of 2013. Please welcome Reverend Judy Cummings.
Good afternoon to all who are gathered here today. And I am grateful to be here today on this holy hill. Thank you for including my voice, a voice from the faith perspective in this very important conversation regarding the death penalty, and particularly regarding justice for Abu-Ali. I do not know Abu-Ali, but I do know the Spirit. And as a minister of the gospel of Jesus Christ, that is a gospel of liberation and justice. I want to remind Christians everywhere that we have a long history with the death penalty, going all the way back to AD 33, when the Roman Empire crucified Jesus the Christ, an innocent man. My faith informs me that all humanity is sacred, and therefore I oppose the death penalty that resides in a broken, biased, unjust justice system. You see, the truth of the matter is that when we kill, we do harm to another. We do not only harm them, but we also harm ourselves. We harm our society. I agree with Pope Francis that executions are an attack on the inviolability and dignity of the person, citing the fact that 85% of executions in the last 40 years have taken place in the Bible Belt, implying that the Bible Belt is the death belt in America. Shane Claiborne said, and I quote, "Wherever Christians are most concentrated in America, that is where the most executions have taken place," end quote. This is due in a large part because the death penalty, sadly, is flourishing under governors who profess to follow Christ, even here in the great state of Tennessee. What a sad indictment.
Amen.
Thus, while conservative Christians have prided themselves on being pro-life on the issue of abortion, too many have proven themselves to be anti-life when it comes to capital punishment. The truth is that the death penalty has survived not in spite of, but unfortunately because of Christians. And it is predominantly white Christians who have provided the moral foundation and theological backbone for defending the death penalty in America, supporting a flawed, racist justice system that disproportionately imprisons people of color, appropriately labeled the new Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. Christians who know the gospel and early church history understand that Jesus and most of the apostles and most of the early martyrs of faith were victims of inconsistent justice systems that allow for capital punishment. Many Christians believe that Jesus would not support the death penalty, and he would not. Even though it is inconsistent with their faith, many of them still do. Anti-death penalty activist Jane Claiborne reminds us, and I quote again, "It does not take courage to say that slavery is a wrong, and generation after generation we have ended it. It takes courage to say that slavery is wrong when it is still legal and socially acceptable. So it is with the death penalty," he says. "I believe we will look back to the death penalty a generation from now, just as we look back at slavery with horror and shame, wondering how we ever thought it was okay and how we used the Bible to justify it," end quote. It has been said that if the Supreme Court justices, the Catholic governors, and the Christian senators of our country will embrace the teachings of their faith, they will be part of making history by making the death penalty history. Clemency does what our Creator requires us to do, and that is to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God. Clemency gives us the opportunity to ensure humanity in our judicial system. Every now and then in life, we get a second chance. Thank you, and God bless you.
Our final speaker is familiar to many of you. She was a a faculty chair and professor here at American Baptist College. Today, she is the director of Children's Defense Fund Haley Farm, a national organization that works toward justice for children impacted by the cradle to prison pipeline. She also coordinates SALT, the School for Alternative Learning and Transformation inside Riverbend. And I see her often on Saturday mornings in line there at Riverbend Coing, waiting to be able to go inside and visit. Reverend Janet Wolf.
Good afternoon. It's an extraordinary gift to be back at American Baptist College, Holy Hill, a good place for this discussion. I do currently work with the Children's Defense Fund alongside our founder, Marion Wright Edelman, and the Reverend James Lawson, a man described by Dr. King as the nation's architect of nonviolence. In December of 2001, I received permission from the administration at Riverbend to expand our SALT classes, Schools for Alternative Learning and Transformation, to expand those classes in order to work with residents in Unit 2, Death Row. So I convened a meeting of those who were interested and asked what they most wanted to learn. I admit I was surprised when Mr. Abu-Ali Abdur'Rahman asked for sessions focusing on community building, conflict resolution, and nonviolence. He explained why this was so important, and others soon agreed. Our first classes on Unit 2 started in January 2012, and the 12 inside members named our group the Community Building and Conflict Resolution Circle. Abu has been a leader in that group for the past almost 7 years and has served as mediator, mentor, educator, peacemaker, co-facilitator, and persistent practitioner of nonviolence and conflict resolution. Largely because of his efforts, Unit 2 is the safest unit in Riverbend, and I suspect in all of Tennessee prisons, a place where correctional officers prefer to be because of what Abu has defined as our mission: working for community healing, mutual respect, collective responsibility to address all the forms of harm, and in everything we do, aiming towards habilitation, conciliation, nonviolence, harmony, and a healthy, loving, safe community. Abu has served as inspiration, architect, and implementation leader in designing, developing, and co-teaching our dispute resolution and peace-building curriculum. These classes incorporate the requirements established by the Tennessee Supreme Court to become a certified mediator in Tennessee, and it equips inmates and staff to effectively address problems in prison, including racial conflicts, incompatibles, conflicts between officers and inmates, suicide, and prison sexual abuse. Abu has been key in adapting the curriculum to the prison environment and developing protocols for addressing conflict situations, protocols that are now being used by fellow inmates as well as correctional officers. This program works. The warden and other administrators have asked us to expand the training into other units at Riverbend. We now have 4 members of our Community Building and Conflict Resolution Circle, so graduates of our classes on mediation and negotiation who have been moved from Unit 2, Death Row, to Unit 5 or 6, the low side. And with Abu and their leadership, we will soon start our second series of classes there. Marion Wright Edelman, the founder of Children's Defense Fund and a nonviolent civil rights leader for more than 60 years, met Abu when she came to Riverbend to engage members of our SALT classes. She joins me today in emphasizing the importance of Abu's work and witness, his leadership and life, his wisdom and wit, his courage and compassion, his vision and his voice. He is not the same person who came to prison more than 30 years ago. We both agree that Mr. Abu-Ali Abdur'Rahman offers a powerfully peaceful presence, a consistent commitment to addressing and resolving conflict, and a generous and gentle spirit of accompaniment with those who are struggling, including inmates, administration, and staff. When our community Building and Conflict Resolution Circle wrote a booklet for young people who were struggling with school and the streets, with poverty and violence, Abu wrote this, quote, "We must learn to consider the feelings and the life of one another, regardless of the tribe or clan one belongs to, or what race or religion one happens to be attached to. We share this earth with others." And he continues, "We are neighbors, and we have a challenge, you and I," he says. Let us work and help one another pave a way to rebuild ourselves and our relationships with one another. Love must be retrieved, revived, and restored." End of quote. This excerpt from our booklet, Consider This So You May Live, captures Abu's deep commitment to healing and peacemaking, to strategic listening and persistent positivity, to building community and resolving conflict. Abu is a source of life and light for many inside and outside the prison, including me. And I am honored to work with him to build community, transform conflict, practice nonviolence, and create circles of communal healing and hope, mediation and peacemaking. Thank you.
I remember asking Abu once on a Sunday afternoon, on a Sunday when we were doing that in the evening, I said, "Do you think God wanted you to be in prison?" And he said, "No. But I do know that God wanted someone to preach the gospel to these men in prison." And he said he was willing to look for somebody who was willing to be inside of their circumstances. So it's not what he wanted, but there's a core of guys that we meet with on Sundays who literally find their whole mission being to give hope and encouragement to the other guys on death row and to try to change their lives. I mean, it blows my mind that they would look at it that way. They're more free, some of those guys, than some of us, most of us on the outside. We're all racing around and they're captive in yet the way they think. But one of the first nights that he, at the end of it, he said, "Do you mind if I close it out with a song?" I said, "Sure." Whoa. Abu-Ali. And I took that video and I took it to our church and put it on a Sunday service at our church, and there were tears in the eyes of people. So he's the one we've not listened to, so this is Abu-Ali.
Amazing grace, Abu-Ali. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found. I was blind, but now I see. His grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears.
Kind of a stunning voice, isn't it? Let's have our panel discussion. We have some experts here, some bright minds, people to discuss this, some questions that have been given to me to pass along, some thoughts that I might have, and we will bring them up. First of all, Brandon Tucker is the Policy Director of the American Civil Liberties Union of Tennessee. Amy Lawrence is the State Coordinator of Tennessee Conservatives concerned about the death penalty. Randy Spivey is the Academic Director of the Fred D. Gray Institute for Law, Justice, and Society at Lipscomb University. Davis Turner is Vice President and Associate General Counsel of RCCH Healthcare Partners. He is a member of the Board of the Tennesseans for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. He's also a surviving family member of a murder victim. And again, Henderson Hill, criminal defense attorney who is the director of Repress, a project that challenges unjust and extreme sentences in North Carolina. Henderson. I'm going to put this microphone time so that you guys can pass when you've got that one.
Or maybe you want to pick it up. Oh, my. Let's try this. Yeah. If they can hear you. And I'll try to holler as a question. Let me ask, first of all, are any of you on the panel have any thoughts on anything that you have heard so far from our speakers? I know we've got tons of them, but anything that quickly comes to your mind, because we do have questions. Any thoughts? Or should I just? All right. Just arbitrarily, I'm gonna put a few things out from each one of you. Some of you I even know. Amy, I've known well, so that's why I'd love to ask Amy. What do you think? What's been the reaction? What's been the talk among conservatives in Tennessee about this situation, this case?
So
Take that microphone out of there if you like.
I've been very pleasantly surprised by the conversations I've had. I speak to groups all over Tennessee, from rural communities to more metropolitan communities, and it's everywhere from college Republicans, women's Republican groups, libertarian groups, and while I would say many of them go into it supporting the death penalty, I will always get someone coming at the end of the meeting saying, I've either always been opposed to this, or you've given me a lot to think about. I had never thought about the arbitrariness, the cost, the innocence. So I've been really surprised by the responses I've gotten, and looking forward to the work that we continue to do.
Davis, if you don't mind, in your conversation with the prosecutors in your brother's case, was the death penalty discussed?
In my case, they never brought up the death penalty because I think in Davidson County in 2001, they established guidelines for when they will seek the death penalty. So that was after Abu's case. So I assume that there was some discussions going in before the case, but they never discussed it with me. Now, I visit a guy on death row, just recently started, see you out there, Rudy. And he's from a different county in Tennessee. And Davidson County is the only one that has those guidelines. And so that's why it's, one of the reasons it's very arbitrarily decided or applied across the state. So he came from another county, Shelby County, where, 44% of the guys on death row come from. I read his case, and his case isn't as bad as my brother's murder case, and yet he's on death row. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
I've often wondered if I had a loved one murdered, the rage that would be inside of me. Was there any part of you when it happened and your brother got murdered, you said, put him to death?
Yeah, I think that's a natural reaction that, from a family member of a murder victim. But I don't think we should ever set policy based on what we would do at our worst moments in time. So it took me beyond that. It took me a while to get beyond that.
I bet it did. Randy, if you don't mind, when we talk about justice, does the death penalty really provide justice?
So I think that's a tough question, because there's a lot of folks that it's not a tough question, but defining justice can be a really tough question. And people feel very differently about that. I've got some students in the back of the room, and this is the question I have them write about over and over and over again. And one of the things that we always talk about is this idea that the Hebrew prophets give us of justice. This idea that what sin actually is the breaking of a relationship. It's not something we do wrong somewhere along the way, it's the breaking of a relationship. And justice is that process by which you put that relationship back together. And I think that really resonates with me. And if you look at the death penalty in that context, there's not a single part of it that is about putting a relationship back together. If you listen to victims' families, they are only heard to ramp up their anger towards for the prosecution's benefit, and then they disappear, and they're left to deal so certainly in that context, the death penalty has very little, if anything, to do with justice.
A question that was asked to, ask both you, Henderson, and then you, Brandon. Henderson first, if you don't mind, so I get it right. If a case has gone through multiple layers of court review, why should we not be able to rely on the judiciary's ultimate conclusion that the death penalty is appropriate in cases set for execution?
Well, Rudy, part of the reason is, it's gonna sound strange to someone who's outside the legal system, but there's something called procedural defaults. And most folks sort of consider them as legal technicalities. But what they do is they distort the processes of justice. So that in Abu-Ali's case, for example, one expects to have a lawyer to advocate for one. But when in actuality, the lawyer never visits the client, never learns the social history, never finds out the circumstances of the crime itself, never finds out the circumstances of his prior history. He is unable to make the system work. And when the prosecutor hides the evidence he knows, the system is unable to work. And then when it goes up the chain to different appellate courts, well, you've lost your opportunity to prove that because you didn't establish that in the first setting. So the higher you go in state appellate courts and then into the federal system, if you didn't do the right thing before, all of a sudden these doors close and you're unable to present it. So in Abu's case, where you have 4 judges looking at the actual evidence, seeing that misjustice happened, they were prevented from doing the right thing because of these procedural defaults. And that's how justice gets mishandled.
Let me tell you one other thing, if you don't mind. I hear about maybe a prosecutor, he's gonna, when the crime happens, I'm gonna get a death penalty out of it. I'm telling y'all, listen to me. Now you got good old boy justice, and you gotta fight that thing through no matter what. Make any sense?
Not at all. Yeah, a good friend and colleague, Brian Stevenson, says that he's able to love each one of his clients on death row because he is broken. Brian is broken. And he recognizes that his clients are broken. And it gives them this commonality, this bond. And, and hopefully when I use that word broken, it's fully in the way that you, Rudy, and Ed, and Ms. Dr. Manning have described an intimacy with Abu-Ali, to see in him the same humanity you know in yourself. And it gives you that common place to show love. And that's what many of these prosecutors who just sort of, grab onto that politically expedient piece, the piece of demagoguery, they miss that. And in doing so, you miss a teaching opportunity for the community, a modeling opportunity for our children, and a failure of the community to reconcile and to restore.
Brandon, I was asked to ask you this question. I'll read it properly. Criminal justice reform has become a national conversation for those on both sides of the aisle throughout the country here in the state of Tennessee. How does the death penalty relate to that greater conversation of criminal justice reform, and why does it seem that the death penalty is treated as a separate issue?
I want to address also what you questioned at the very beginning of the panel, and I think we were all quiet with regards to if we were impacted by something that we've seen here today in order to not speak too much. But Henderson just brought up a Brian Stevenson quote, and one came to mind during this entire presentation, which is another Stevenson quote, is that we are more than the worst things we've ever done. And the idea and the presentation here today exhibited perfectly that Abu-Ali has gifts, he has talents, he has compassion, and he has something to offer his community and to the world, both inside and out. And only if he was given guidance and love early on, you could only imagine what type of impact he would have row. But to your question, look, the death penalty is the embodiment of everything that is wrong, that we recognize as wrong with our criminal justice system. We recognize that we criminalize poverty, we criminalize mental health issues, we criminalize addiction to narcotics, we criminalize childhood trauma. We recognize that bad policies perpetuated during tough on crime eras are now a mistake. You have people who own up to the mistake of being swayed by racist rhetoric, by rhetoric of fear, to promote bad policies in order to win elections and ensure or promote this idea of safety. And so if all those things are on the table, and we recognize and we're honest about all those things that we recognize are broken in the system, they're amplified and magnified when you talk about the death penalty. And because all those things are large contributors, if you still have DAs who embrace the tough on crime mantras, if you still have individuals suffering from mental health issues that are never properly diagnosed, if you still have a school to prison pipeline, they may one day make it to death row. And the idea that we can have an upfront conversation about various specific aspects to the criminal justice system, whether it is de facto life sentences for juveniles, or long-term solitary confinement, or lengthy sentences for nonviolent offenders, or harsh sentences for violent offenders. All those things are made possible because there's a death penalty. And you have to recognize that some of the biggest problems, they pale in comparison to having someone on death row. So if you have individuals who are elevating all of these wrongs within the death penalty or within the criminal justice system, it's because at the end of the day, there's an existence of the death penalty. And moreover, one last thing that comes to mind as well is something that Stacey Rector mentioned from the Tennessee Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty, is that everybody in this room, and lawmakers and advocates, recognize that there were bad policies in the 70s, 80s, 90s, things that perpetuated mass incarceration. And if we're honest with ourselves, then people on both sides of the aisle can have that conversation. But the new wave of individuals who are being requested dates for new upcoming executions by our Attorney General, they are a product of that era that promoted bad policies. So as we talk about being very upfront about the criminal justice as a whole, there are people who suffered during the era and during a time where we made horrendous mistakes, and they should be a part of us correcting that mistake as well.
And part of the problem that the system has done is it's chosen finality over reality. And so the desire to be done with a case and the desire to have a finality allegedly for the victims, then we ignore what's out there. Part of my career has been in attorney ethics. And I've like Henderson, I've looked at this transcript and I've looked at this case, and for the lawyers in the room, it's an embarrassment. It's an embarrassment what happened in this case. It's an embarrassment that a lawyer can reshape a case in a way that results in a man being on death row. And so the desire of the system is that things are done now. We've been through the process, so we're done. And in doing that, we're ignoring all of the things that have happened, all the brokenness, not just on Abu's side, but when you look at the way the system works, the system is just now learning to take into account the brokenness of the defendant. We haven't even talked about the brokenness of a society that is wrapped up in racism and classism and punishing poverty, or the brokenness of a prosecutor who's trying to get a win and has political pressure to do this. We haven't even begun to address that kind of brokenness.
One of the hardest things for me when I started going to death row was that I would give my wife, I would tell her the names of some of the guys that we were meeting with, and she'd look up their cases and she'd go, "Good Lord, And I said, but you're not looking into the eyes of this person. They've now been on death row for 30 years. These are redeemed men that I spend time with, and they've tried, their countenances are different. If somebody, either any one of you, if somebody's on death row for 30 years, what do we gain by putting them to death?
Yeah, well, 30 years is really the extreme. I see and ask that same question even after 10 years or even less. Because what prison is, and I'll put it this way, I represented a child who turned 18 the week before he killed 5 people. And this is more than 20 years ago. He's now in his 30s. You know, prison is the first time he was safe. You know, the first time he was safe from environmental toxins, first time he was safe from physical abuse, first time he was safe from sexual abuse. You know, in prison, he was illiterate, a dropout, you know, way before high school. You talk to him now and he's like a PhD candidate. I mean, he's read everything. Yeah, again, I don't know Abu, but he's sensitive, reflective, he's engaged with communities on the outside. You know, but for the fact that 5 innocent souls are lost, it would be an easy question, you know, should he be back in the community? At some point, you know, there's a risk thing that goes on, and it becomes politically untenable that you expose the community to that risk. But you have to ask, is that the best we can do? Is this the best we can do? You know, this now 35, 36-year-old is looking at the next 50 years being locked up. Is there a better way for community to respond to violence? That's the question that we have to wrestle with and come up with a better answer.
You know, what I wrestle with to some degree, I'll go inside there and I see these men and I tell them I love you, you're my brother, because God loves you and all of that. Boy, I had to remind myself there are victims as well. There are a lot of people in this world who have been abused, but they haven't killed someone. We can't just give them out. I mean, we've got to have a justice system, and it's hard to do, isn't it, Amy? Or I don't know if you wanted to talk about that. Have you forgiven the man who murdered your brother?
I have forgiven him. And I didn't get the chance to tell him that. And so one of the questions I had for my ministers was like, does the person that you forgive need to know that he's forgiven? And they told me no. But when I was on Capitol Hill on Justice Day, when I was going around to the various legislators' office and I was telling my story about my brother, this one lady takes me aside who I didn't know before that day, and she said, well, she asked me the same question, have you forgiven the man that killed your brother? And I said, yes, I have. He goes, well, I'm his aunt. And so that was pretty powerful, that, you know, and powerful moment for me.
Well, it would be for me too, you're just saying that. Amy, for me, the guys that I'm amazed with, and Sunday night we talked about it again, are the guys who literally had to get to the point of forgiving themselves for what they did, to look at themselves. You think of David in the Bible was a murderer, Moses was a murderer, and Paul was Saul and contracted and such. The hardest thing for them, and I think it's only through faith that they're somehow able to do that, isn't it? Important.
Yeah, I think you're right. Now, I'll have to be honest with you, I don't come at this issue from a moral objection. That's not how I became opposed to the death penalty. I think that I, like so many, would hear of these heinous crimes, and you get that gut feeling, and this feeling that death is just. But then what we like to say in this movement is support the death penalty is a mile wide and an inch deep. So when you start looking at who really is on death row, is it every murderer? Well, of course not. We have thousands of murders in Tennessee, and not all of them get sentenced to death. We see that here in Tennessee, around 50% of our death row comes from Shelby County. 2% of counties in the entire United States make up the majority of death sentences. So it really makes you wonder who is getting sentenced to death. Is it the worst of the worst? No, it's usually depends on the county, on the prosecutor, on the judge, on the jury. There are a lot of factors that go into it that make this an arbitrary system.
Brandon, if you allow one final question with our time limit, and it was asked, well, what is the current state of the death penalty in the United States, and where does Tennessee fit into that analysis?
So the death penalty nationwide is fading away. It's withering away, and we have to be honest. We have to embrace that, and we have to recognize that at times, because of something is diminishing, it can cause us to become a little bit complacent, and there's still so much more work to be done. But just to dig into some figures, we're having fewer and fewer executions, less death sentences. From year 2016, 2017, 18, and 19, we had less executions than we had in 1999 alone. And I think from 2011 to 2018, a 7-year period, we had less death sentences handed down than we did in 1998, 1999 alone. And so we're coming off the heels of a very bad time, but we're moving in a direction to where the country is turning its back on the death penalty. And we also, I think maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago, hit a 40-year low with regards to approval rating of the death penalty. So, and a lot of this, death sentences, executions, approval rating, it has a lot to do with the work Henderson does and other lawyers who are litigating the case. It has a lot to do with advocates like the coalition here and the ACLU throughout the country, and so many more advocates on the ground who are working in the state legislature to abolish the death penalty. But this conversation is happening in a robust, real way on the right and the left. Places like Colorado, places like Washington, or excuse me, Washington State just did away with their death penalty, but Colorado, Louisiana, Utah, Montana, excuse me, Nebraska. These are places that are having robust conversations with regards to abolishing their death penalty. And here in Tennessee, so that's nationally. It's becoming a thing of the past. But here in Tennessee, we had a lot to be proud of in Tennessee. From 1960 to 99, there were 0 executions. So this trend and why it's so troubling and why it's so important to be here in this room, to advocate, to make your voices be heard for clemency, is because last year in 2019 attributed for 5 of our state's 11 executions. And now our Attorney General wants 9 more, and he wants Abu-Ali in that number. That's the wrong direction. And so we have something to be proud of. Tennessee has never been in love with the death penalty, but where we are today in Tennessee is up to advocates, is up to organizations. I know where the Attorney General wants to take us, and it's in the wrong direction. But historically, Tennessee was a leader in this space. Barring full-on repeal of the death penalty, should hold its head up high in its position in this nation, and how few executions we've had in the state of Tennessee.
All right, well, Brad, we've just scratched the surface. But I thank you, Amy and gentlemen, for spending your time with it. I was a spiritual advisor for Stephen West, who was executed on August the 15th. He was like a brother to me that tore my heart out. And I'm reminded, I think it's in Ezekiel 33, where it says, surely as I live, declares the Lord, I take no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but that they would turn from their ways and live. And so we have something to stand for and look at. There's the victim we have to feel for. We need justice, but we also need an honest look at how we're doing that. So I thank all of you. I know there may be some media questions afterwards, so making yourselves available, but I thank you for taking your time and your effort to be here, all of you. And I thank all of you for spending time with us this afternoon. I think we've covered it, but God bless you and have yourselves a great rest of the day.